looking at Judges chapter 8, 9 and 10, we see 3 more people actually rose within the community of Israel, taking control for the plight of the people. Now last week we saw how Yahweh took Gideon along with 300 men and attacked the mighty army of Midian, and how in the dead of night 3 small groups surrounded the camp of Midian, and at the signal of Gideon everyone blew his shofar, broke his pitcher, the one that contained the light. And the noise was so sudden, such an outburst of both sound and small lights from every direction, that it completely startled the men of Midian, and they began attacking each other in a state of complete confusion. They were so overwhelmed and surprised by what had happened. They thought they were being attacked by a large army. That, of course, was the work of Yahweh, going before Gideon and his men. Now Gideon's men were armed with nothing more than their shofars and their light-bearing pitchers. Yet, they sent the whole Midian army running towards the border and the river. In chapter 7, verse 24, Gideon sent messages through the hills of Ephraim, with the message, "Come down and attack Midian, and capture the rivers before they get there." So all the men of Ephraim came together and seized the rivers as far as Beit Bahar, known also as Bethany, east of the river. Now the men of Ephraim also captured 2 of the Midian chiefs, and returned their heads to Gideon as confirmation of their success. And the army of Midian were completely conquered at the hands of Yahweh. Not one of Gideon's 300 men had weapons of war. As Yahweh had said in chapter 7, verse 2, when he was gathering his army together, "There are too many people with you for me to hand over Midian to you." Yahweh said, "Because I don't want Israel to be able to boast against me, saying, 'We ourselves saved by our own strength.'" Armed with just their shofars and their pitchers, they managed to set Midian to flight. All that had been achieved because Yahweh's hand indeed was over the Midians, and Gideon had been promised that would occur. So moving on to chapter 8, we see once again peace is restored to Israel, and it remained that way until after the death of Gideon. However, as we see in chapter 8, there develops a struggle between the tribes of Israel. In the absence of an external threat from the neighboring nations, the 12 tribes began to turn upon themselves. It begins with the men of Ephraim sharply criticizing Gideon because they had been rejected when the men had been gathered to fight against Midian. They were among the men whom Yahweh had rejected at the water drinking test at the stream, as we saw last week. It was not because they lacked the skills for fighting men, but because Yahweh wanted only 300 men who could not possibly win a battle against the size of the Midianites. However, the men of Ephraim were not aware why Gideon had chosen just 300 men, who were basically inept in the arts of warfare. They did not know that the choice was based on what Yahweh had said to Gideon in chapter 7, verse 2. However, Gideon managed to calm the men of Ephraim down by saying in chapter 8, 2 and 3, How can what I have done compare with what you have done? God handed over to you the Midian chiefs, Oreb and Zeev. So what could I do to match what you did? By saying that, he appeased the anger of the Ephraim. Having chased the men of Midian across the Jordan and through the eastern territories possessed by the 2.5 tribes of Israel, Gideon called upon the people at Sukkot in the territory of Gad for bread to feed his 300 men, who at that stage were exhausted after chasing the Midianites. But the response from the clan chiefs at Sukkot was hostile towards Gideon. As we read in verse 6, you haven't captured Zebach or Zalmunna yet, so why should we give bread to your army? Those two were kings of Midian, who at that stage was still on the run ahead of Gideon. Gideon's response in verse 7 is interesting. If that's your answer, then after Yahweh puts Zebach and Zalmunna in my hands, I will tear your flesh apart with desert thorns and thistles. Now Gideon moved on to the next town, Penuel, where he received a similar rebuke. That time he responded by saying, when I return safe and sound, I will break down your tower. Going on from Penuel, Gideon finally caught up with the forces of Midian at Karkor. It was Karkor where the 2 Midian kings thought they were safe from the pursuit of Gideon. Yet, once again, Yahweh threw the army of Midian into a state of panic, and with the help of Yahweh, Gideon struck down the army of Midian and captured the 2 kings. As a side note, in verse 10, we are given yet 2 more exaggerated numbers in relation to the size of the Midian army. Now, Zebach and Zalmunna were in Karkor with their army, about 15,000 men, who were all that remained from the entire army from the east, since 120,000 arms-bearing soldiers had fallen. Now these 2 numbers are extremely exaggerated in comparison with the real size of armies of that time, that period. So having captured those 2 Midian kings, Gideon returned to Sukkot and Penuel and found the clan leaders in both cities saying to them in verse 15, you insulted me when you said we hadn't captured Zebach and Zalmunna yet, so why give you bread to exhausted people? With that, Gideon broke down both the tower of Penuel and put the men of both cities to death, as an example of the consequences of contempt that they held towards Yahweh and Gideon and the men who were in need. Sometime later, Gideon challenged Zebach and Zalmunna about how they had killed his brothers during the war or the battle Yehoshua had fought against Yavan and the Canaanite kings at Hatzor, which was spoken about in Deborah in Judges chapter 4. It appears those 2 Midian kings may have been supporting Yavan and the Canaanites at Hatzor during that battle. So, as the kinsman redeemer, or avenger, Gideon killed both kings and brought an end to the domination of Israel by Midian. Israel's true ruler. In verses 22 and 23, as a victor over the Midianites, the men of Israel wanted Gideon as their ruler. But what was his response? Neither he nor his sons would be their ruler. They would always remain, that position would always remain the sole prerogative of Yahweh himself. He alone would be their ruler. And Gideon then asked the men who had fought with him to give up their booty in the form of earrings and which the Midianite soldiers had worn. Now, wearing earrings, gold earrings, was a practice of the Ishmaelites, Now the Ishmaelites and the Midianites were closely related, as we see in Genesis, at the time when Joseph was sold into captivity. Gideon took 42 pounds of gold booty and fashioned it into the ritual vest and put it in place in his hometown of Ophrah as a reminder of the overthrow of the Midianites. But as verse 27 continues, all of Israel turned it into an idol, and thus it became a snare to Gideon and his family. So, for the rest of Gideon's life, they rested from external warfare. 40 years. When Gideon finally died, they buried him in his family tomb at Ophrah, having he left behind 70 sons as his heirs. Along with those sons was also the son of the concubine, whose name was Abimelech. In verse 33, we're told as soon as Gideon had died, the people of Israel immediately went astray back to the Baalim. This time, Baal-Brit was their god. Continuing in verses 34-35, they fought Yahweh their God. They forgot Yahweh their God, who had saved them from the power of the enemies on that every side. And they showed no kindness towards the family of Gideon, to repay them for all the good that he had done for Israel. The same pattern continued. The 12 tribes failed to remain united with Yahweh as their ruler and king. Each tribe considered itself independent. They all wanted to be free from the need for unity. They did not want to be one community under the rulership of Yahweh. Once again, they lost the love not only for Yahweh and his Torah, but they also ignored all that Yahweh had given to Moshe. Instead, they sought to worship Baal. And in verse 33 it says, they sought after Baal-Berit, the Lord of the covenant, who became their God, the small g. So that brings us to chapter 9. Now this whole chapter is devoted to the internal breakdown of the family of Gideon. Following his death, the leadership struggle developed. The son of Gideon's concubine made a bold bid for the leadership of the city of Shechem. He approached his mother's clan chiefs and his maternal grandfather, cajoling him into asking the men of Shechem who they wanted as their leader. Would they prefer 70 sons of Gideon or Abimelech alone as their ruler? He even went as far as to point out that he was a blood relative of the people of Shechem. Verse 3 says, his mother's brothers spoke to the men of Shechem and said all this about him, so that they followed their feelings and supported Abimelech, arguing, after all, he is our brother. Clearly, he had ignored the words of his father Gideon when he said, Yahweh alone is your ruler. Abimelech had set himself up as the ruler of Shechem, but it was not done with the blessing or the call of Yahweh. Having gained the support of the men of Shechem, he was given money from the temple of Baal-Berit, which he used to buy the support of a band of good-for-nothing thugs who looked to him as the leader. As part of the leadership coup, Abimelech and his gang charged to the house of his father Gideon, killing the 70 half-brothers, apart from the youngest one, Yotam, who managed to escape. So having killed the opposition to his leadership, the men of Shechem elevated him to the title of king. Yotam, upon hearing what had happened, stood on the top of Mount Gerizim and challenged the men of Shechem to consider what they had done. Now verses 8 through 15, Yotam calls upon 3 trees in an allegorical discourse. First he calls the olive to become the leader, secondly the fig tree, and then thirdly the grapevine. All three trees refused the role of leader. Then verse 14, finally all the trees said to the thorn bush, "You come and rule over us." In response, the thorn bush says in verse 15, "If you really make me king over you, come and take shelter in my shade. But if not, let fire come out of the thorn bush and burn down the cedars of Lebanon." Now Tam then concluded his allegorical discourse with the words, "Here's the point. Have you been honest and straightforward in making Abimelech your king?" He continued by reminding the men of Shechem that his father Gideon, under the hand of Yahweh, had removed the oppression of Midian from Israel. And now Gideon was dead. They were again rebelling against not only the household, but also, more importantly, against Yahweh himself. Now Tim finally laid a challenge before them in verse 19. "I say this, if you are dealing honestly and righteously with Gideon and his household today, then may you enjoy Abimelech, and may he enjoy you." His challenge was that if the men of Shechem were being deceitful, Yatan called on Yahweh to bring severe consequences upon both Abimelech and the men of Shechem by destroying both by fire generated from each other. Yatan then realizing the gravity of his discourse, he feared for his own life and fled to Beer, which is a town about 7 miles from Jerusalem. Verse 22 tells us that all went well for both Abimelech and the men of Shechem for 3 years. But then Yahweh engendered a spirit of discord between both parties. Yahweh brought discord upon all of them and their responsibility for killing the sons of Gideon. Just as Yotam had said in closing his discourse, the consequences should fall on both Abimelech and the men of Shechem, because both parties were equally guilty. Now we come to the plot and counterplot. In comes Gaal, son of Ebed. Suddenly he appears in Shechem, along with his brothers. Now we're not told who this character is or where he came from, but some rabbinic sources have suggested that he was from an outside nation. Whoever he was, along with his brothers, they settled in Shechem, and the men of the city began to trust him. And they started bad-mouthing their leader, Abimelech, to this newcomer. In verse 28, Gaal responds, "Who is Abimelech?" Think of the contrast with Shechem. Why should we serve Abimelech? Isn't he the son of Gideon? Isn't Zebul his officer? Serve the men of Hamor, the father of Shechem. Why should we serve Abimelech? The words of this verse at first reading appear rather confusing. That is, until we look at the scene behind and consider the two characters that are being mentioned there. The first character is Zebul. The officer appears to have been a governor or deputy to Abimelech in Shechem. Next one mentioned is Hamor, the father of Shechem. He was the ancestral father of the city of Shechem. From him, the patriarch Yaakov actually bought the parcel of land, and that was the place where Joseph was buried when Israel arrived back in Shechem. He is also referred to 10 times in Bereshit and once in Yehoshua chapter 24. Now, having established who these two characters are, we can now begin to understand why or what Gaal was saying to the men of Shechem in verse 20. If I were in control of this people, I would get rid of Abimelech. Then addressing his words to Abimelech, he said, "Come out and fight. I don't care if you make your army larger." The men of Shechem had fallen out with Abimelech by that stage and wanted him removed from his leadership. Such were the intrigues and the guilt of these guilty parties. Finally, the words of Yotam's discourse were now coming true. "Have you been honest and straightforward in making Abimelech your king?" Clearly, they had not. Gaal, during his discourse with the men of Shechem, had been overheard by Zebul, the governor of the city, and he passed on the details of the plot to Abimelech. By that time, Abimelech himself was residing in Tomar, about 6 miles away from Shechem. So having been made aware of the uprising of the men of Shechem, Abimelech gathered together the fighting men and laid siege to the city. The struggles that ensued between Abimelech and the people of Shechem are recorded in graphic detail in verses 30 through 55. However, Gaal and his brothers were also forced to depart from Shechem, and the city was reduced to ruins by Abimelech. Abimelech then continued his pursuit, burning down their strongholds and killing 1,000 men and women. He also continued his murderous rampage, moving north to Tevetz, which he captured. All the men and the women in the city also took refuge in the town's tower. When Abimelech approached the tower to burn it down, just as he'd done in Shechem, a woman drops a millstone from the roof of the tower, cracking his skull while he was at the door of the tower. After his death, the siege of the city ended, and Israel returned to their respective towns and cities, and relative calm settled over the people once again. Chapter 9 concludes in verses 56 and 57 by drawing the reader's attention to the fact that Yahweh had visited the much-needed consequences upon both Abimelech and the men of Shechem as a result of their having killed 69 sons of Gideon. The words of the allegory of Yotam, spoken from the top of Gerizim, finally became a curse upon the city of Shechem, because all their wrongful actions that had been carried out in conjunction with Abimelech were finally brought to fruition. That brings us on to chapter 10. After 3 years of domination by Abimelech and the men of Shechem, there arose another from the tribe of Issachar, named Tola, who lived in the hills of Ephraim. He judged the people for 23 years. He was one of the 6 minor judges who led Israel during the time between Jehoshua and Shaul, the first king of Israel. Immediately after the death of Tolma, there arose Yair from Gideon, who continued the leadership for yet another 22 years. He again was another of the 6 minor prophets or judges, about whom little is said. Then again, of course, Israel starts backsliding. After the death of Yair, Israel again turned to serving Balaam and Asherah. This time, they were serving not only the local gods, but also the gods of Aram, Zidon, Moab, Ammon, and Philistim. Each of the 12 tribes of Israel appeared to have pursued one or more of these 5 national gods. So it is no wonder that Yahweh handed them over to outside forces. This time, they were actually being controlled by the Philistine on one side and Ammon on the other. If you look at the map, Philistine, of course, is modern-day Gaza, while Ammon was across the river, east of the Dead Sea. Israel was being crushed by 2 strong forces. It lasted like that for 18 years, domination from both east and west, until finally they cried out earnestly in verse 10 with the same lament, "We have sinned against you for forsaking our God and serving Baalam." In response, Yahweh reminded them again how many times he had served them and brought them out of Egypt, delivered them from a yoke of bondage, and delivered them into his land. So why should he heed their cries any longer? Enough is enough. Yahweh said in verses 13 and 14, "You have abandoned me and served other gods. Therefore I will not rescue you anymore. Go and cry to the gods you chose. Let them rescue you when you get into trouble." This time they were truly on their own. 7 times in the period of Judges to date, Yahweh had delivered them from the overlords, but this time he turns his back on them. This time they were on their own. As a result, the people became very remorseful, crying out in verse 15, "We have sinned. Treat us in whatever way seems good to you, but save us, please." Again, the chapter draws towards an end on an improving note. In verse 16, they got rid of all their foreign gods and once again served Yahweh, and he became troubled by Israel's misery. But still Yahweh did not send them a deliverer, even though he felt their pain. He held fast for a while longer to ensure that their contrition was genuine. Yahweh also allowed the forces of Ammon to establish themselves in Gilead, while the people of Israel camped at Mizpah. Now Mizpah is a very important location for Israel, because it was there that Yaakov made his covenant with Laban. When he was returning home from having been in Haran for 20 years, he crossed the river, and it was that point where he made the covenant with Laban, that Laban would not encroach into the territory of Israel, and Yaakov would not encroach into the territory of Haran. Finally, in verse 18 of the chapter ends with the clan chiefs in Gilead making a vow that whoever leads them into battle against Ammon will become their recognized leader. Again, they're failing to wait upon Yahweh to make the choice on their behalf. They still have not recognized that Yahweh is their real leader and their real king. He alone is the one who must choose the leader who will deliver them from the yoke of external nations. In chapter 11, we will meet the character who will lead them against Ammon. Now, has Israel ever changed between Joshua crossing the Yarden and the coming of King Shaul? Yahweh had rescued them on 12 separate occasions, each of which resulted from their attitude towards Yahweh and his Torah. Every time they became comfortable and settled, they intermarried with the local people and again followed and worshipped Baalim and Asherah. Up to this point in the book of Judges, there's been no mention of the Kohanim or the Levim or even the Mishkan, which at that stage was residing in Shiloh. The whole focus has been solely on the rulership struggles and how Yahweh had raised up strong leaders to bring Israel back from the worship of the Baalim. At no stage did Israel choose to follow the ways of Torah. In fact, Torah is not mentioned in this whole book. It is a sad indictment upon Yahweh's people that they went far away from him all the time that they were settled in Eretz Israel. What about the time of Yeshua? Was it any different? When we look at what happened in the time of his ministry, nothing had changed. Having read the words of the prophets and heard the messages of Yochanan the Immerser, the leaders of Yehudah still did not listen to what Yeshua was saying. Yochanan spoke forth with profound zeal on many occasions with the words particularly from Matthew chapter 3 verse 2. "Turn from your sins to God, for the kingdom of heaven is near." Then Yeshua, when he began his ministry after the adversary had challenged him, he says in chapter 3, verse 17, "Turn from your sins, for the kingdom of heaven is near." Same thing, same story. Yeshua's time, the leaders of Israel had clearly learned nothing from what was written, nor from their oral traditions and history. That same instruction, turn back to God, was repeated throughout the remainder of the first century by Shaul and the other emissaries. Yet 40 years later, after the death of Yeshua, their time in Eretz Israel came to an end for the second time. Yehuda was thrust out into the Hellenistic diaspora, and they remained there until 1948. Even when they returned to Eretz Israel, they still did not turn back to Torah and turn back to Yahweh. The early waves of returnees were totally secular. They wanted to establish a nation, but they didn't want Yahweh at that stage. Just like their forefathers in time of the judges, they kept looking westward for support of the nations that they had been released from. Even today, modern Israel is still closely bonded to the nations of the world. Their reliance on Yahweh is minimal. However, many people should hold fast to the teachings of Torah. There is enough knowledge out there now, promises of Yeshua, that he is the Mashiach of Israel, should be confirmation enough that there should be no discussion on this matter. Just like it was in the days of Judges, when the people of Israel were enticed away from Yahweh by things around them, even today, most people will put the world ahead of Torah. Therefore, the same question must also be asked in the community of Yeshua. Why do people who have come to know and embrace Yeshua, Torah, and the prophets elect to turn and walk away and seek after the doctrines and teachings of men? They don't seek Baal, but rather listen to the words of other people who are giving false messages, where they should be listening to the words of Yeshua himself. Turn back to God, for the kingdom of God is near. She also said, in what we read in Hebrews chapter 10, particularly in verses 15 through 17, the Ruach HaKodesh bears witness to us, saying, "This is the covenant which I will put within them after those days, says Yahweh. I will put my Torah in their hearts and write it on their minds." And he then adds, "Their sins and their wickedness I will remember no more." And that is a golden promise from Yeshua, that he holds out to all who walk in his ways and listen to his Torah. It is the same narrative today as it was in the generation who saw Yeshua walk in the flesh. And it's the same narrative as given to the generations living at the time of Judges. All generations have been called to accept Yahweh as the only true God. All else is folly. Shabbat Shalom.